All right, so designing for knowledge. Not long ago, I had a bit of a realization, kind of a moment of clarity. My whole career, I've been working on design projects for people, for organizations, and ultimately they all kind of wanted the same thing. They wanted to promote their content, and they wanted to sell products and services. Right, so that was fine. But then after years of doing this, I started to see that there was another pattern. That what I really thought was technical work to solve specific problems was actually about a bigger picture. And that driving most design problems were actually big fundamental questions about the world. For example, what defines contemporary art? Or how does government work? Right, big problems, big questions. And the problems I was being asked to solve were actually about something else entirely, that they weren't really about problem solving at the end, but instead about the creation of knowledge. And so today I wanted to talk about the role of design and how it's changing from being focused on problem solving to now gradually becoming more focused on creating knowledge. So let's take a step back. Over the years, as technology has changed, so has design. And so you all know the Gutenberg printing press. It laid the foundation for modern typography, really through the invention of movable type. And so at this time, designers were really highly skilled craftspeople. But due to technology, in this case the printing press, they were able to shift their focus from designing individual artifacts to creating systems and replicable outcomes. So that was kind of a major shift for design back in the 15th century. Then later came the Industrial Revolution. And this was, again, a major shift. It brought about huge societal change. And so products were now being manufactured for a mass market, right? And this led to the emergence of mass market advertising. Again, a big shift for design. So now graphic design could focus on communicating broadly to a whole new class of consumers. And industrialization also gave rise to a new approach to design called Modernism. And really the big accomplishment of Modernism was accessibility, making design accessible to anyone and everyone. And so in the process, it actually fundamentally changed how people lived their lives. And as a result, design grew increasingly programmatic. So it was through innovations then like the grid that design became about creating systems that could scale and adapt. And again, this allowed design to evolve, yet again, from what was previously a primarily craft-based discipline to now a practice that was more based around ideas and concepts. And then came, of course, the PC. And so with the invention of the PC, another major inflection point, design started to become more about interfaces. And so designers then began to study human behavior. How do people use products and systems? And the goal was obviously to design more natural forms of interaction. And this again gave rise to a new form of design and new design disciplines, such as human-computer interaction, interaction design. And so while this was going on the one hand, on the other end of the spectrum was another movement called critical design. And this was almost a response to functionalism. And so critical design was about providing a critique of how we use products, why we use products, and their overall societal significance. And so now designers became critics, presenting objects in a new context, recontextualizing them. And it was all for the purpose of creating dialogue, generating dialogue about big issues in the world. And then finally, with increasing specialization, again, really another fallout of the industrialization, organizations found that they could use design, and particularly the design process, to bridge silos and to bring about innovation. And so you all have heard about IDEO, I'm assuming, a design firm that pioneered the concept of design thinking. And so this was a new approach to design, a human-centered approach to really designing anything and everything from products to businesses. So this all happened, and along the way, as technology has changed, so has design. And in the process, as technology has changed, so has the way that we consume and create information. And so now, once again, design is evolving, and this time it's actually in response to the growing quantity of information in the world. And I probably don't need to tell you this, but there has been an explosion of information. So in 1986, the world's total amount of data, digital information that is, was 20 million gigabytes. That's a pretty large number. When I first saw this, it seemed like a large number. And this is 1986. But then 30 years later, that number has actually increased to 4.4 trillion gigabytes. So this is in 2013, 3 years ago. And that's actually an increase of over 200,000 times. So a massive explosion of information. And it actually turns out that the world's information doubles every 2 years. So you can do the math. That's a lot of information. And we create more and more information and data every minute. So these stats are fairly up to date. You know, in the course of a single minute, we upload 72 hours of YouTube video. We post 216,000 photos on Instagram, 277,000 tweets on Twitter, 2.5 million posts on Facebook, 4 million Google searches are conducted, and 204 million emails are sent, all within a single minute. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that at this point in time, we're creating more information than ever before in history. And so this poses a challenge, right? It's becoming increasingly difficult for all of us to stay on top of all of the information in the world, the information that we both create and consume. It's simply becoming too complex for the human brain to process. You've all heard about Richard Saul Wurman, I assume, a few nods. He was the founder of the TED conference. And in the 80s, as far back as the 80s, he actually wrote a book called Information Anxiety. And it was all about information overload. The premise being that we're so inundated with information that it causes anxiety. So we're increasingly unable to keep up. And this is back in the 80s. So today, the issue of information overload is even more relevant, even more pertinent. And so obviously it's a huge problem, but it also presents a huge opportunity. And that's really what I want to talk about. The question is, how do we manage the growing amount of information in the world? But how do we not only just manage it, how can we make sense of it? How can we begin to understand it better? And so how can we take all this information and turn it into knowledge? That's really the opportunity. And clearly we need new interfaces. The tools that we currently have at our disposal are just increasingly insufficient to process the growing amount of information. And it's remarkable to me that most organizations still use software that is over 20 years old, designed for a completely different context. So we need new interfaces that will help us understand all the information in the world and that will help us navigate it. And these are interfaces that are both intuitive, but they also need to scale. They need to scale with all the information out there. Interfaces for big data. And I think that the key to designing these interfaces is data visualization. So data visualization, some people think it's an art, some people say it's a science, and then some people say it's a technology. But really it's all three. It's an art, a science, and a technology. And data visualization can enable discovery. So it can help us generate insights from large sets of data. And it can also help us tell stories. It can help us tell stories about the data and ultimately help us as people make better decisions and take action. And so what we've seen over the last, I want to say 20 years or so, is how data visualization has moved into the mainstream. It was formerly really an academic discipline. But over 20 years, it's gradually moved into the mainstream. And it's become popularized, especially through the media, where it's been used frequently to explain complex issues. Here's an example from the New York Times. They really have one of the best graphic teams around, and they publish really amazing visualizations frequently. And so it's been popularized in the media, and we now call this data journalism. But what's interesting is as visualization has moved more into the mainstream, it's also shifted its focus a bit. Where it used to be about designing single-purpose applications, one-off applications, it's now becoming gradually about multi-purpose tools and platforms. And so an example is the entire field of business intelligence applications, BI, which includes products like Tableau. Have you guys some of you have heard of it? Yeah. A great product. And it's just indicative of this entire field, which is all about giving businesses new tools, better tools, to make sense of the troves and troves of data that they now collect. So that's one end of the spectrum. But then on the other end is the quantified self movement. So this is much more about the individual and bringing visualization to a mainstream audience. So the quantified self movement, you all know about Fitbit and the Apple Watch and other such products that are really about letting you discover insights from your health and fitness data in order to ultimately live healthier, better lives. But these two use cases are really just the beginning, I think. And ultimately, the use cases are almost endless, right? They range from platforms that are designed for specialists and experts, like the area of business intelligence, all the way to platforms that can make information management more intuitive and more accessible to large mainstream audiences. Okay, and what all of these platforms ultimately have in common is these two modalities. Understand and interact. Understand is about turning information into knowledge, about deriving insights from data, whereas interact is about what sorts of things can I do with this knowledge that I've gained, and how can I translate that knowledge into action to help me make better decisions, for example. And these two modalities then map to two disciplines that we've already covered. On the one hand, data visualization, which again is all about insight and turning information into knowledge, and design thinking, which is about understanding the use cases, understanding how people, the kinds of things that people want to do with data and information. And it's where these two come together that I think the real opportunity lies. It's the convergence of these two disciplines that I've been calling data visualization as interface. And the role in this case, the role of design is the creation of knowledge. It's all about creating intuitive, accessible tools and platforms that can help people make sense of the information that they create and consume in order to make better decisions and to take action. All right, so back to where I started, my moment of clarity. So I started my career, as Lisa already mentioned, as an interaction designer at the design firm IDEO. I was there for a couple of years, and it was during that time that I was introduced to design thinking while working with a pretty wide range of clients, from large corporations to hospitals and cities. And then my path eventually led me to Pentagram, another international design firm. So I moved to New York and worked with Lisa Strausfeld, who was a partner at Pentagram, and really is a pioneer in the field of data visualization. And so there we worked on data-driven interfaces. And it was during my time at Pentagram that I was able to connect these two disciplines, design thinking and data visualization. And I thought I'd just share 3 projects from that time. So the first project, and this is probably the highlight for me, was the one laptop per child. This was a project, an education project started by Nicholas Negroponte, who's the founder of the MIT Media Lab. And so the one laptop per child was a low-cost laptop for children all over the world, in particular children in developing countries. And the interface, I think, was actually one of the first to put people front and center, people and the activities that they're working on. And really, it's an example of a data-driven interface. So what you can see in the interface is people clustered around activities that they're working on around you, nearby. And you can choose to participate or reach out to any of the people represented here. So it's a data-driven interface as an approach to designing an operating system for a laptop. And we also worked on media installation projects. This is one example for a museum called the Museum of Arts and Design in New York. So they're focused on design objects primarily, arts and crafts. And we were brought in to create a suite of media installations that basically covered two general domains. There was the informational media that was about wayfinding primarily and kind of guiding you through the space. It was about promoting programming and objects in the collection. And you can see an example on the left. And then on the other end, we worked on interpretive media, which was for the gallery spaces, to allow people to get more information about the objects on display, and to basically dive in and understand how they were related, and maybe start to look at some of the connections between objects and some of the the movements perhaps, or the kind of artistic parameters of the objects on display. And so the collection interactive, which is shown here, is again an example of a data-driven interface that lets you explore the entire collection of the museum through a set of filters and sorts and other devices that again let you sort of enrich your experience of the museum through additional information. And in addition to these categories of projects, we also worked on data-driven websites. And so here's one example of a site that we did for Diller, Scofidio, and Renfro, a New York-based architecture firm. And again, the site is a good example, I think, of a data-driven UI in that it reflects their entire body of work, their entire portfolio represented in a three-dimensional space. And it lets you, like we saw before, filter down by category, sort the information in a variety of different ways. And so that, by filtering, you could look at buildings or art installations or any of the other categories of work that they focus on there. So I think all of these are good examples of these two areas coming together, design thinking and data visualization. And so then after Pentagram, I spent a couple of years working at Microsoft. This was my move to Seattle. And everyone was scratching their heads at the time. But it was a great experience. And I was there designing data-driven interfaces for search products, and mobile applications. And so it was just a way for me to really deepen my focus on these kinds of experiences. And then a few years later, I broke off and started Schema, which is a research and design firm based in Seattle. And we focus on the design of information. And so a lot of the work we do relates to data-driven interfaces and data visualization as interface. And so in the remaining time, I thought I would share 5 projects, recent projects that we've worked on. And yeah, they should give you a sense of the kind of work that we do. And I hope it's interesting. Starting with invisible cities. This was actually one of our first projects that was about providing a platform for social data in an urban context. And it's really more of a research project, actually. It's about visualizing Twitter and Instagram data for cities like New York, San Francisco, Tokyo, and Seattle. And the idea is to help you discover the hidden social networks within a city context. It was inspired by this diagram by the French situationist Guy Debord, who was really a big source of inspiration for us. This actually shows the city of Paris. In particular, it shows the neighborhoods of Paris, which are isolated from their urban context, and then linked by ephemeral walking pathways, which is what the arrows represent. And so to us, it reflected a city that was defined less by the architecture less by the buildings, and more by the moment, the experience of being there. And that's really the thing we tried to embody in Invisible Cities. That was the source of inspiration. So here's what it looks like. Invisible Cities is a three-dimensional data visualization. As I said before, it pulls data in real time from Twitter and Instagram. And that's what the white dots represent. So those are individual tweets and photos streaming in. And as they stream in, they're then mapped to a three-dimensional landscape of the city. So here you're actually looking at New York. And if you can see, there's Manhattan in the middle, and then you have Brooklyn and Queens. And obviously, there's a much higher density of information in the center of the city, in Manhattan. And so what you can see is over the course of 24 hours, as the data streams in, it causes the landscape to change, to deform, and creates these hills and valleys that ultimately reflect the overall, the aggregate accumulation of information within any particular area of the city. We also track topics, and these are on the right-hand side. So the topics are derived from the content of tweets and photo captions, and these are ranked in order and then presented there on the right-hand side. And they actually serve to link individual data points, so that these topics ultimately become a navigational device. You can select a topic like time, or tonight, or whatever it may be, and follow that pathway really from beginning to end through the data that we're collecting. At any point, you can zoom in. You can view individual updates, status updates, tweets, and photos. And you can also go back in time to see how the overall landscape might have evolved. This is up to 24 hours. And initially, it starts out flat, but then as the data streams in, it becomes increasingly articulated. You can see it's a little hard to see here, but you can see the hills and valleys starting to emerge. And then ultimately, you can see the full sort of aggregate picture with hills and valleys and spikes for current events, representing, again, the sort of relative distribution of data for that particular period of time. And so in addition to New York, we worked on a version of Invisible Cities for Seattle, which is shown here. Much less information. San Francisco. I think that's probably the stadium, right? Giant stadium. And Tokyo. And what's interesting about all of these various visualizations is that they really embody the differences in the urban landscape of these different cities. So where New York was very centralized on Manhattan, the visualization of Tokyo emphasizes the fact that there are multiple city centers, from Shinjuku to Shibuya and so forth. And so I have a short video that I thought I would show of the overall experience. And so this was actually built to use the Leap Motion controller, which you can see here. And it's, we found it a great way of navigating a three-dimensional environment using natural gestures. And so you can pinpoint individual nodes and see more information. And then you can also go back in time, which is what this is showing. You can rewind, go back up to 24 hours, and see the landscape change accordingly. The topics still require mouse input, but they then let you follow these topic pathways, beginning to end. And you can see also when you scrub over how the connections change. And that's fast forwarding again. So Invisible Cities was really one of the first, as I mentioned, one of the first projects we worked on that was about creating a data-driven information platform for creating knowledge. And in this case, the kinds of insights that you would get are all related to understanding the city better through social activity. What's happening in the city today? What were some of the main themes and topics that were being discussed? And all of this in relation to specific places and locations. The next project is called Legislative Explorer. And so this is a project that we worked on in collaboration with the Center for American Politics and Public Policy at the University of Washington. And it was all about visualizing Congress, visualizing bills in Congress using open government data. So, and in fact, we use 40 years worth of data. And it all started here. When you think about the process of how a bill becomes law, you may think initially that it's a linear process, something like this. But as it turns out, the reality is actually quite different. You know, bills go back and forth many times between the different chambers. They move between committees until some of them end up on the president's desk, get signed into law. Others may never end up there. So it's a highly nonlinear process, and the visualization actually shows these patterns of lawmaking through actual data. And here's what it looks like. So it begins with a conceptual or a semantic map of Congress. On the left-hand side is the Senate, and on the right-hand side is the House, and then in the center, the White House, or the president. On the extreme left and right are the individual sponsors. So there you have your senators and representatives. And so as bills are introduced, they start on one of the two ends and move through the process. And so bills are represented as particles. You can see them here. And they're color-coded by party. So the red bills are Republican-sponsored. The blue bills are Democrat-sponsored. Yellow bills are independent, very few of those. And so again, as they're introduced on either side of the screen, they work their way through the process. And so you can play back the entire duration of a Congress. This is the 112th Congress, but you can actually go back all the way to the 1970s and look at the various patterns way back then. And then you can apply various view controls, such as filters. So you can filter down to only Democrat-sponsored bills or bills sponsored by Republicans. And you can also filter by topic. So this would be filtering to energy and looking at only the bills that related to energy. And then we also have a set of more specialized filters, which include filters like gender, if you want to look at the gender breakdown between male-sponsored bills and female-sponsored bills. And then finally, you can zoom in on the map to see these bills in more detail. And so this really gives you a way to interrogate the data at a more granular level, looking at the content of each bill, and then also it lets you link off to the appropriate page on congress.gov, which is where the data comes from. So here's what it looks like in motion. So you can play back a Congress, and you'll see the bills stream in, work their way through the committees. Some of them end up there. And then this shows filtering, so filtering down to Republican bills versus Democrat bills. And at the same time, you can still scrub back and forth through time and see those bills move through the process. And this is filtering down to topics like health or energy. And then finally, you can zoom in, like I showed before. And you can look more closely at the content of individual bills. And so, one of the things that people always ask me when they see this is, okay, but can I see it over time? I would like to see, the whole 40 years worth of data. And while I haven't included it here, we actually recently added that capability. So if you later go and take a look at this online, then you can actually see the overall arc as well. And it's a different level of inquiry. And there's some interesting patterns that you'll see there as well. But so similar to Invisible Cities, Legislative Explorer is a platform, right, for visualizing open government data. And so here it lets you uncover insights relative to legislation, from understanding legislative topics to who were the primary sponsors, to what were the bill's success rates overall, and what bills were ultimately signed into law. All right, and that brings me to the next project, which is called Catching Tigers and Flies. And this is a collaboration with Chinafile. They are a publication of the Asia Society in New York. And it's a visualization of corruption in China. So as we found, since assuming office, China's leader Xi Jinping started an anti-corruption campaign targeting thousands of officials in government and the military. And so that's been going on now for quite some time. And the folks at Chinafile have actually been manually collecting data from public announcements, announcements that were made by the government as well as the media in China. And they've been gathering all this data, structuring it, and adding it to a huge spreadsheet, which you're looking at here. And this really became the starting point for us. The question was, how do we take all this information and make it accessible, make it presentable, so that you could then begin looking at patterns and relationships in the information? And so our process then started by asking questions about the data. For instance, who were the most connected individuals? And what sectors were the most corrupt sectors? And it was from these questions that we then developed the user interface. So here's what it looks like. This is looking at all of the targeted officials, of which there are, I think at this point, well over 1,000. And so the central element is a grid of icons that differentiate between tigers, who are the upper level, the high level officials, and flies, who are the lower level officials in government. And it also differentiates between the stage of investigation, whether they're simply under investigation, or whether they've been expelled or arrested, or whether they've been sentenced. And so that's what the colors represent there. And there's different ways that you can manipulate the view. So apart from the chronological view, which we started out with, you can sort the view by sector, by stage, which is what this shows. And so there you can now compare the relative quantities and how many people were sentenced versus just investigated. And then using filters, again, you can also narrow down the set of individuals according to status, according to location, according to time, and sector. And you can also search by name to look for specific people. So this is actually filtering down to only tigers versus looking at only flies. This is looking at only officials under investigation, officials who have been expelled or arrested, and officials who have been sentenced. And then in the lower right is a heat map of Chinese provinces. It's an abstract map of Chinese provinces that shows you at a glance where the highest quantity of targeted officials was. So you can see that just at a glance, but also you can click on individual provinces then to, again, filter down to that specific set of people. And finally, the timeline allows you to also look at a specific time frame. So initially it's set to everything, but you can scope it down to look at only one particular time slice. And then as you hover over individual people, that's where you start to see the connections. And so this is one individual who's fairly connected, but then this guy is actually the tiger with the most connections of all people in the data set. And he has the largest account of corruption. This is Zhu Yongkang. And so if you click on him, or any person, you can then dive into their profile and look at how much money was involved, for example. You can look at when they were put under investigation, when they were sentenced. But you can also see their networks. And so here we show all the connected individuals, tigers or flies, based on the distance or the strength of the connection, whether they were family, whether they were from the same city, the same province, or whether it was just a national connection. So you can see those sorts of patterns here. And you can pivot on individual people as well. So if I go and click on one of those connections, then I can look at their profile as well. And so it becomes a method of browsing the information, of discovering new insights as you go along. And then finally, there's a sector view, which we're actually in the process of redesigning. We're continuing to work on this. But here it showed the major sectors that individuals are connected to. And so these include sectors like law, military, real estate, and they're, again, color-coded so that you can see the relationships and the relative distribution of sectors. And so, from the beginning, the visualization was designed as a module that you could embed. You could embed in any blog or website. The idea being that journalists could not only use it as a tool to uncover, new patterns and insights, but they could then also, leverage it on their own websites to add some additional commentary around it. And so here's an example of an article on the Foreign Policy website. So kind of like the previous ones, this is a platform for data visualization. However, the real difference is that in this case, all the data was collected manually. And so it becomes ultimately a way of exposing all that data to the public, of making it accessible and really letting anyone discover new insights about this information. And then as an embeddable tool, it allows for others to communicate their insights and share them with their audiences. So this is filtering down to the individual provinces and clicking on stage versus year. And I think one thing that's important to mention about this that also pertains to the others is that it's all about giving you control over the individual data records. Unlike a lot of visualization that relies more on charts and graphs and aggregate data, here you can actually dive into the individual data point. And that was the case also for Invisible Cities and for Legislative Explorer. All right, so the next project this is another recent project that the studio worked on. The data? Yeah, so you can go to chinafile.com. Actually, the URL is anticorruption.chinafile.com. The Asia Society in New York, yeah. All right, so next project was a collaboration with Microsoft. Actually, this was Microsoft Research. And I wanted to show this one because it's a great project, first of all. And it's also an example of a generalizable tool in that it allows you to actually visualize any set of information, any data set, up to hundreds of thousands of data points. And so this is the project of Stephen Drucker, who's a principal researcher at Microsoft. And we were brought in sort of towards the end of the project, mainly to clean up the UI and figure out how to make it intuitive, and how to make it as broadly usable as possible. So here's what it looks like. These are actually some of our process screens that I included here. And the tool, kind of like the other examples, it represents every data point as individual particles. This is actually a data set of census tracts across the country. And it shows about, I guess about 50,000 census tracts. So that's how many particles you see there. And this is where you start, with just a flat, unstructured list. So that, in and of itself, is not particularly useful. But it's a good starting point. And so how can we start deriving meaning from it? Well, one thing you can do with this tool is that you can select a different view. And so the first thing you might then do is go to, say, a scatter plot, where you could specify the x and the y axes. And so here we might select latitude and longitude and end up with a representation that looks something like this. So these are all the census tracts across the country. And you can start making observations now about the data. So it's geographic data. And also what you can see is that the census tracts are much more dense over in the east than they are in the west of the country. Okay, so that makes sense. But what else can we do? So one thing that you can do then is you can go in and set other facets. For example, you can start to color code the particles. In this case, we're going to color code them to reflect the level of education within each census tract. And so this now creates a gradient from low to high levels of education, which you can see on the right. And it's a little hard to see here on the projection, but it then pinpoints certain areas across the country that have a particularly high level of education. I imagine this would be one of them. But then also you can see all of the areas in between as well. And it presents a very nuanced picture of, again, census tracts across the country. This is another example, and this is a data set based on passengers on the Titanic, which is one of the data sets that they include. And so like the previous one, it begins with a flat list. Fewer data points here, of course. But again, I can select from various views to structure the data. And so to begin with, I might go ahead and select a column view to look at a histogram. And in this case, maybe I'm interested in ticket prices. So how much did people pay for their tickets aboard the Titanic? And it turns out that it's a pretty drastic disparity there between those who paid very little and those who paid a lot of money for their Titanic tickets. And in fact, all the way over here, you have 4 individuals who paid the most. And on closer inspection, it turns out that they were all first-class passengers. Makes sense. So then we can select that grouping of, in this case, 4 people, and change the bins to reflect the passengers who survived and those who did not survive, all the while keeping our selection of the 4 passengers fixed. And voila, we can see that those people who paid the most for their ticket prices also were among the set of people who ultimately ended up surviving the Titanic. An overall smaller set than those who didn't. So it's these kinds of stories that Sandance can help you understand and that it can tell. And so here, again, is what it looks like in motion. The transitions are actually an important factor to keeping context when you move between the different views. And so this is looking at a histogram. You can go in and specify the facets that you're interested in. So this would be color coding by those who voted for Obama in the last election. Looking at per capita income as opposed to education, which we had before. And then you can go again from a column or a histogram representation to a scatter plot. And then as you set the x-axis to longitude, now we're looking at latitude and longitude relative to each other, and that produces a geographic representation of the data. And then from there, what this showed is that you can also specify a particular facet to select, for example, only that top bracket of education and highlight those particular areas across the country. And then for the Titanic data set, this is what that looks like. Very similar. You can go to a different view, columns, and see the data redistribute. And again, the histogram with the ticket prices, selecting individual data points, looking at the details. And so ultimately you can keep going until you start to really uncover these sorts of stories and insights from the data. And so unlike many of the previous examples, this is a true multi-purpose platform in that it can really visualize any data set. While there are certainly benefits to platforms that are focused on a specific type of data, a tool like this also has immense power in its flexibility to help you discover insights really from any data source. All right, and I have one more. And this is again more of an experiment, I guess similar maybe to Invisible Cities, something that the studio worked on about 1.5 years ago. And it's an application for Google Glass. We were, like many people, among the Glass Explorers, or part of the Glass Explorer program. And so we decided to focus on an application that would let you capture the memorable moments throughout your life by taking short video clips anytime that you would enter a new location. So of course, this would rely on wearing the glass unit throughout your day. So you would record short video clips, And at the same time, you could then also annotate those clips with how you were feeling at the time, whether you were happy, feeling sad, or creative. And these feelings were organized in 10 categories. But then you could also set the intensity. So, if I said I was happy, I could then specify that I was either satisfied, very happy, or elated. And so feelings actually form the core of the experience. And really the idea is to create this journal almost of your life that you could go back and revisit at any point. And so next I wanted to show a short video of Journalist, which is what the app is called. And this was shot by the Schema team entirely using Google Glass.
Hey guys. Hey, welcome to Seattle.
So for those who haven't been to Seattle, this goes through all the tourist destinations. Gasworks Park to Space Needle.
Let's check it out up there.
It usually is that gray in Seattle. That's the library. Great piece of architecture. What's really interesting about the glass is that it had that first-person perspective. It's quite powerful, as if you're looking through someone else's eyes. All right, so that was Journalist with a Y. And let me just show you briefly how it worked, or how it works. Journalist has two modes. There's record and review. And so using Glass, you record those clips throughout the day. And it's really based on 3 steps. Whenever you enter a new location, you'll receive a prompt that it's time to record. And so then you can choose to record a short 3-second clip just by tapping on the device. And next up, you would then tag your clip with how you're feeling. Whether you're, in this case, feeling creative, and then you can specify that you're feeling inspired. And that's it. And then the clip is sent up to the cloud. The entire process only takes a few seconds. It's meant to be really as unobtrusive as possible. Okay. And then later, you can go online to review all of your clips. And so this is broken out into 3 primary views. There's the days view, which aggregates all of your clips by the day. So it's really more of a calendar representation. And so you can actually then go in and replay each day individually. You can click on a day and see all the clips that you took that day. You can also share them on Facebook or Twitter. So that's the days view. The feelings view then aggregates clips by feeling. And so here you can see all the clips where you were mellow or interested or nervous, and replay all those clips sequentially. And then finally, there's the places view, which shows a map of all your clips and the locations that they were taken in. And so here the colors are actually used to represent the categories of feelings, so that over time you could see how you were feeling on aggregate in any particular area of the city. And even though Journalist, is still a prototype, our vision was always that as you would use the application over time, then you could end up with something sort of like this, where it would actually accumulate until you could see the general distribution of emotions or feelings across the city, either just for yourself or for a much broader swath of the population. And so unlike many of the other examples that I showed that were focused more on analysis, journalists, the reason I thought it would be good to show is that it's a prototype, again, of a data-driven interface and application, but in this case, it makes the data experiential. So it's more about creating an experience, and yeah. And so these were just a few examples of data visualization as an interface, but clearly we're still at the beginning. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and I believe that it actually represents a huge opportunity to not only solve problems, but to ultimately make our lives better through information. And so what I hope is that this was interesting, that I could shed some light on, I guess, how design is changing, right, from becoming about problem solving to increasingly becoming about creating knowledge. So, thanks.
Thanks, Christian. We'll open up for questions. Please use the microphone. It's not for sound amplification in here, as you guys have probably already noticed. It's for our online community. Questions?
I was wondering if you've done a study or some kind of summative evaluation on journalists.
No, unfortunately not yet. It hasn't actually been that widely used. It was really just something that we did more as an experiment, as I said. And the goal was always to make it more broadly available. But then Google announced their plans to discontinue the glass, at least for the foreseeable future. So we've had some ideas to turn it into more of a mobile application. But I think that one of the key points of journalists was really the first-person perspective. So, I would say it's probably going to come back at some point. But until then, the project is more in a holding pattern, or at least until we can figure out what to do with it.
What about like informally? Like, what did people who used it, or the person who used it
on
say?
the team, it was pretty interesting. I mean, one thing we found, and we actually spent about a year in prototyping mode, just sort of understanding the kind of experience that glass could enable. And I guess one thing we found is that after a while, when you wear it, it does feel very unobtrusive. It's just always there with you, so you don't have to reach for your phone or anything like that. So it felt actually very, in that sense, very lightweight. And again, this is just sort of anecdotal from us on the team. But then in terms of how you would use it, it's mostly about, I guess, capturing the moments that would otherwise go unnoticed, throughout the day. At least that's sort of how we saw it becoming useful. Or the moments that you might notice, but then, that they would be fleeting and disappear the next minute. So it's about actually retaining those and having a way to go back and sort of revisit those everyday moments that would otherwise just go unnoticed. Yeah. But it would be very interesting, I think, to see how others would use an application like this. So maybe it'll come back.
First of all, thank you for the talk. This was like super interesting. I guess I was wondering about the process aspect of this design, and also if you could share how you come up with the design metaphors for different visualizations, like the isotypes, the iconography.
So that's a great question. What we found is that with these projects in particular, the process tends to be very organic. So this is somewhat counter, I think, the sort of typical design process where you would start with research and concept design and design development and so forth until you get to production. But with these kinds of projects, very quickly you get into more of a prototyping mode, I would say, where it's all about validating initial assumptions that you might have. But so, typically what would happen is that we would get a large data set from a client. So actually, take the catching tigers and flies, for example. So we inherited that data set, and together with ChinaFile, we spent a few weeks in the beginning just really looking at it, understanding, what were some of the patterns that we could perhaps see when we start giving form to it. And then pretty quickly we went into prototyping, starting with low to mid-fidelity prototypes in design software like Illustrator or Sketch, And then after that, let's see, I think then we created an initial prototype in this case it was D3, just to start seeing what it would look like. And from that point on, it actually evolved quite a bit. And that's, I think, very typical for these projects. So once you start seeing the data, then you would start tweaking it, making adjustments. So it's very iterative. But I think one thing was clear from the get-go, which was the focus on people, right, on officials, and the breakdown, right, between tigers and flies. So in terms of the iconography, I would say that came together very quickly in that particular case. And then it was really primarily about how to make the iconography as intuitive, as clear as possible. And so we played with a couple of different, you'll remember this actually. So you were somewhat part of this process in the beginning.
Data collection process? Yeah, I was working on the data collection on that project. And yeah, a lot of manuals like collecting because there's no like well-formed data set in China, and we have to go on to the disciplinary commission website in China and do the web like scraping from that part. And but unfortunately the website is not very structured, so we have to do that over again manually. Yeah,
it was very involved, very involved. Yeah. And then I know that we played through some different forms of iconography as well, from people to actually literally representing tigers and flies, and but it was very organic. I think that's quite typical. With Legislative Explorer, that one, I think there too we pretty quickly went into prototyping. There we used processing, which some of you may know. It's really a creative programming language built on Java, and a great prototyping tool actually, just for putting some form, getting some form out there based on data. And so there I remember we had 3 or 4 different interaction models that we were testing to sort of see what kind of patterns would they reveal. And at the end of that process, we ended up going with what you saw, which is that's the semantic map of Congress and watching the bills flow through. But it took us probably a couple of months before we actually arrived at that very specific format. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So I do news graphics, and the topic of this year, like in a lot of computer-assisted reporting conference, is static is the new interactive. Like static is the new interactive. Huh. So I feel like the things you do at Schema is more dealing with big data set, and there's a lot of interactivity in there. How do you see this trend going in both like news, like the graphics used in news, and in design? It's kind of 2 different things, but I don't know. How do you think of it?
I haven't heard of that trend. Static is the new interactive?
Yeah, it's like this, the New York Times graphics editor, he had this like being like widely quoted, said if you have to make users click, something amazing has to happen.
Oh, right, yeah. Well, that is true. Yeah. I would agree with that. I think there's different use cases there, right? I think when it comes to the New York Times or data journalism in general, it's about communicating a complex phenomenon, an event or an issue, in a way that could make it understandable to many people. And so there, I would agree that it's really about minimizing the amount of work required to get to the conclusion or the insight. That's different from data visualization as interface, where it's really about creating interfaces that can allow people to find those stories for themselves. So it's much more of a self-directed process of discovery, really, and letting you kind of become the author of your own stories, the stories that you would uncover from the data. So I think it's just 2 different use cases, and I think both are really interesting and equally valid. But to me, I think the real opportunity that I see is in new interfaces, simply because, as I was saying before, I think it's clear that the software that we're currently using is not suitable for the growing amount of information that we have to process. And what those interfaces are, I think that's the big question. In some ways, I think the verdict is still out. And we're just at the beginning. So yeah, we'll see where it goes.
Right. So first of all, you had some really cool examples, and shout out from Seattle as well.
Yes.
But I noticed that a lot of your data sets are retrospective, large sets of data.
Yeah.
I was wondering, what sort of considerations would you take if your data was arriving in real time, something like a stock ticker or health data in a hospital?
Right. Yeah, well, actually, Invisible Cities is kind of like that, since it pulls in data in real time from Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, it's quite different. It's quite different. In a way, the tool, I think, has to be a bit more open-ended. And I mean, in that case, actually, it was tricky because of the unstructured nature of the data that we were looking at. So it only allowed for certain things, for, like we had to, in order to get the topics, we had to really do, some pretty basic keyword matching, I guess, on the unstructured content that we were getting. So yeah, I think that it does change what you can do. I think when you have the benefit of actually using a predefined data set, what you can do is create a more specific experience based on sort of unlocking, I guess, specific patterns within the data. Actually, an example is, well, I mean, in a way, they're all kind of growing data sets, but I would say Legislative Explorer was one where, we were looking to actually bring out some very specific sorts of insights that were more around the clustering, the clustering of bills within any particular stage of the process. But you can only really do that if you have a pretty well-defined data set, well-structured. Otherwise, and I think Sandance was actually indicative of this, you build these more general platforms that can then be used in a variety of different ways. But again, the difference is that there, it's in a way less about the role of metaphor and aesthetics and more about how do you just design the most intuitive multi-purpose tool for data sets. So yeah, so I guess, I don't know. Yeah, it is complicated. Yeah.
In the examples that you gave, most of them were a direct mapping between the features that were already in the data set and the visualization. But of course, there's trends of like machine learning trends like clustering, dimension reduction, things like T-SNE, Word2Vec, things like that enables more some data extraction process or machine learning process on top of it. Does that require something different? Is it something you consider in other projects?
Yeah, we haven't thought too much about that yet. I think it's an interesting area. In some ways, again, like it's a different domain. And I think that there are cases where it makes sense for certain insights to be sort of handed to you. I mean, certainly when it comes to like platforms like Google Now, right? It can be a huge help in terms of letting you know when is the right time to to leave, so that you can still make your appointment. These kinds of things. You don't want to always have to be in a situation where you're, coming to all those conclusions on your own. But then I think there are situations where visualization and data visualization as interface is valuable. And those are more, again, the situations that are more discovery-oriented. So how those integrate with machine learning is a really good question. I imagine there would be some integrations, but yeah, we haven't thought too much about it. Do you have any thoughts?
It seems that a lot of the new machine learning data work is interactive.
Yeah.
Since if you do something and it is results, you go back and forth.
Yeah.
So I think it's natural that it develop to be something that uses visualization in more sophisticated ways.
Yeah.
But I don't see much of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, maybe we'll focus on that now moving forward. But yeah, there's definitely opportunities there. Yes.
With regard to like the Titanic example, the shift from one image to another allows the person viewing the visualization to tell themselves a story.
I mean, going from one view to
going
another
from
view.
one view
Yeah.
to the next. These 4 people paid more. These 4 people also survived.
Yeah.
There is a story there, and everywhere I go, people are telling me correlation is not causation.
Right.
And we've even said that sometimes in this process you're validating your initial assumptions. So my question is, how do you go about making ethical and purely factual and good representations? How can you ensure that in your work?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is intuitive, frankly. I mean, you just have to kind of make those decisions when you get to that point. But it's mostly, I think, about being as objective as possible, right? Not letting your own kind of biases get in the way, I suppose. How we do that is just by constantly checking ourselves against, is this the most objective way to represent something? I mean, there are actually situations where that is not necessarily the goal. Right now, we're actually working on an interactive infographic that is really more about communication and telling a very, very specific story. It's not really about data visualization per se. But so, there your goal is quite different, and it's really more about the subjective story that you want to tell. But otherwise, yeah, it's just constantly checking yourself, making sure that it's as kind of neutral as possible.
Sure. Within that that space, you do have this new avenue for communicating with people. Something like that story of the 4 people who paid more and also survived. Right. Is that something also worth exploring, these implications?
Yeah, and I think that actually when it comes to visualization, it is a storytelling device at the end of the day. And I've sometimes talked about rhetoric, the rhetoric of data. And no matter how hard you try, right, any structure that you create will already have inherent biases, no matter how hard you try to make it objective. So you could say that, all right, given that it is a rhetorical device of sorts, maybe we'll sort of follow that chain of thought and actually just really steer it in that direction. But I think it is dangerous, right? Because then you end up causing others to make certain inferences that may or may not be correct. Right. And we've had that happen very often. I mean, a lot of the times, it's part of the process where you'll start to see, some. I mean, actually, what happened to us recently that actually caused a bit of a thing in Seattle. we visualized data that had to do with visualizing building permits, and Seattle right now is undergoing a huge building boom. There's a lot of new construction going on, and also a lot of demolition. And so we visualized demolitions in the city, really in order to make more of a general point. And what happened is that we, in the visualization, we neglected I think it was more of a communication thing, but we neglected to mention that it was only for a very specific time frame. And it exaggerated the effect. And so the result was that we kind of got caught in the middle between 2 sort of opposing factions in the city, those who were pro and those who were against the new construction. And it's those situations that you really want to try and avoid as much as possible. We learned it the hard way, and but that always happens. And it's a lot of the time it's human error, but sometimes it's also you make a particular aesthetic choice that can lead people to also make certain inferences that are just not not called for. Yeah.
Anyone else? Any burning questions? No?
No?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Christian, for coming.
You. Yeah, I had fun. Thanks so much.